So some major developments here on turn number 16. We'll start on the Eastern Front. And if you look, there's hardly any units on the board for either side right now. They've been kind of slugging it out for the last couple of turns and really have whittled each other's forces down significantly. The big news was Moscow fell, so the Germans took Moscow, captured Stalin. Now, there's only 4 medium armor left in Moscow. The Germans had to sacrifice their entire air force. They had, I believe, 8 Stukas and 1 medium bomber, and they lost all of those. The Russians got some really good rolls, especially on the first 2 rounds of combat. And the Germans sacrificed the air units just so they could have some decent ground units left in Moscow in case the Russians tried to counterattack and recapture Moscow. But that doesn't look like it's going to happen. Other than that, the Germans moved some units around, took some more territories. They moved up into the Transcaucasus. They now have that. So the Russians, with the defeat of Moscow, have moved their capital in the Far East to Novosibirsk. So that is their new capital, although they did lose all their money this turn to the bank, and that was like $51. So that was a significant blow for the Russians. They continue to move this stack of infantry up from the Caucasus. They're at the doorstep to Stalingrad, but I think Stalingrad will fall here this turn on the German portion of the turn before the Russians can go. And they do have some units back here, a heavy armor, 4 mechanized, and an infantry with both a major and a minor factory. So they can still produce units in European Russia. So it's not completely over, but before the Russians can get back to Moscow, I'm sure Germany will beef up its defenses. There's 4 more medium armor right behind the territory in Moscow, so they'll move into Moscow this turn. And the Germans also have some fighters in Leningrad that'll move over. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of territories left in European Russia that have any IPP value that the Germans don't currently possess. So the Russians are definitely pushed back on their heels. In Western Europe, starting to get to the point where there's going to be a major clash between Germany and the Western Allies. So the Germans, for the second turn in a row, spent all their money in West Germany building up defenses. They moved some more mechs from Bavaria into Paris, and they moved their entire fighter force into Paris as well. So Paris now has 1 infantry, 3 towed artillery pieces, and about a dozen fighters and a dozen mechs. So it's a pretty strong German defense in Paris. And then just back in Germany itself, you got a stack of 20 infantry in West Germany, 8 mechs, and then 8 medium armor in Bavaria. So I think it's going to be really hard for the Allies to break through. I don't think Paris is going to fall. Even if they maybe land somewhere else in Western Europe and don't go directly for Paris, those dozen German fighters, especially with the long-range aircraft tech, can reach anywhere in Western Europe. So it's going to be really hard for the Allies to break through. I don't think Paris will fall, and certainly not Berlin. As far as the Western Allies, they went ahead and the British bought more infantry, and they do have a stack of a half a dozen transports that can bring these men over this turn. And then in this southern French territory, just outside of Paris, is all of these combined U.S. and British units. So it's about a half a dozen U.S. Tanks and infantry, about a dozen British infantry, and then we've got 3 British fighters, a couple of U.S. fighters, a U.S. tactical, and a U.S. medium bomber. And then the U.S. right in Lyon Castile, 1 territory behind that, have got another 5 tanks, medium armor, and 5 infantry. So the Allies do have pretty significant units on the continent. Again, I just don't think it's going to be enough to break through and make a serious challenge on Paris. The Germans will probably counterattack on this turn. They might even be able to take out all of these Allied units. Again, that's about a dozen mechs and a dozen fighters. So or Germany could decide to just spend their entire build in the West again. And I think they have, with bonuses, like $95 this last turn, some ridiculous amount. So, and just kind of wait for the Allies to come at them, because the Axis are still far and away in the lead as far as victory points go. The U.S., again, trying to do a little shuttle service. They've got another 5 medium armor and 5 infantry in New York and in the Northeast. And they've got a couple of fleet carriers, some subs, some 3 light cruisers ready for protection to come over. So the U.S. is still doing what they can to get forces over into Europe. But again, I think it's going to be a little bit not enough time left, depending on how the variable game-ending rolls go. And then the U.S. landed in Leon Castile instead of C-Zone 48, just because they wanted to land the units in Leon Castile itself, so it's adjacent to the one French territory the Western Allies currently own. If they would have came over here to 48, yes, they would have had the major port to get the extra movement for their ships, but then they would have had to land them in Leon Castile itself. So not this northern territory. So I misspoke. It's not, Leon Castile is not this northern territory. It's this southern Spain territory. So they could have landed in Leon Castile and got the extra movement for the port, but then that would have put them additional one territory behind the French territory that they want to continue to defend against the Germans. So they landed over here instead, this northern Spanish territory that at least borders with France itself. So now these 5 tanks and 5 infantry will come up onto that territory this next turn, as opposed to being stuck in Leon Castile. The mountains slow down movement, so they'd only be able to move 1 and still be 1 space away from France. So that was the thinking as far as landing up in this C-Zone as opposed to C-Zone 48, even though 48 did have the extra movement because of the port. So that's how things are shaping up for the Allies. As far as the Italians, they're continuing to build up a massive fleet in the Mediterranean. So they came back. The U.S. had pretty much vacated Gibraltar just because they're trying to send everything up into France that they can. So they had to basically sacrifice Gibraltar. The Italians landed there, and they've got their entire navy minus 1 destroyer in C-Zone 80. And that's 2 battleships, 3 light cruisers, half a dozen destroyers, 3 transports, 3 subs, 2 fleet carriers with 2 tacticals and 2 fighters. So unless the British can take Gibraltar back this turn, Italy is going to go before the United States in turn sequence. So the Italians are going to come on out into the Atlantic. And that's part of the reason why the U.S. can't just simply buy transports and ground units to move over into Europe now. They have to start buying some surface ships, because this is a massive Italian fleet that can take on anything the U.S. currently has in the Atlantic. Even with the British fleet combining with the United States, I still think the Italians have the advantage. And the Italians dropped down another fleet carrier and 2 more battleships this last turn as well. So they just continue to spend almost all their money in naval units, because there's absolutely no danger of Rome being under attack, and pretty much all of Africa is Axis now. The Italians even moved up into southern Russia, took a couple of territories that don't have any IPP value. So now they're only 2 territories away from Novosibirsk. So the Russians are going to definitely have to drop units down there just to guard against this small Italian force that's coming up from the south. In Africa itself, the Japanese tried for the second time to go into Cameroon, and for the second time they got pushed back, and there was no Japanese units that survived other than a single fighter. So they did take a couple of infantry off the Allies, but Japan's going to probably have to buy a couple of units to put here in South Africa to try to finish off Cameroon. The Italians brought a cavalry over just to add for some defenses, so that the Free French wouldn't just come on out and take the Belgian Congo back. So that's about it in Europe. Over on the Pacific side of things, We had another pretty big naval clash. So the Japanese came up with the remnants of the fleet they had in the Indian Ocean, came into 56, and finished off a couple of U.S. light cruisers or heavy cruisers and 3 damaged U.S. battleships. And they still have 2 battleships, a battle cruiser, and a heavy cruiser left. For units, they went ahead and bought a dozen units they placed in Tokyo. So there's a total of 13 infantry there. They also bought a tactical bomber in Rihe, and then a tactical bomber and a cavalry down in Calcutta. They also came back and took Hong Kong back from the CCP, and also took Kwangtung as well. So Japan's starting to make some moves in Southeast Asia. The CCP responded by bringing their entire Air Force 3 fighters down bordering India, and they also bought 3 cavalry they put up north to deal with the resurgent Japanese in Rihe. So as far as the battle in China goes, Japan doesn't have a lot of ground units on the board, but they do have 3 tacticals in Calcutta, and then in Formosa they got a tactical and a fighter. So they got pretty good Air Force going to add offensive punch to start taking back some of these territories. And a lot of the CCP territories have absolutely no units in them, so the Japanese can kind of just walk right in there. The Russians moved everything up to western Manchuria, besides this 1 infantry that took Korea. But the Russians definitely do not have the resources to spend over here in the Far East. So this is going to be all the Russia's going to contribute to the effort against the Japanese. So Japan will probably start pushing back against the Soviet Union here pretty quick. As far as Australia, they bought another transport and a destroyer, moved their entire fleet over here to Sea Zone 146. So now with 2 transports and a little bit of protection with 2 destroyers and a light cruiser, they can kind of come out now and start taking some of these islands back now that the Japanese fleet is up in the Japanese home waters. The only naval units the Japanese have at all in the South Pacific is just these 2 subs that are convoying Australia. So then the U.S. landed on the Japanese home island. Now, obviously, once Japan dropped down all those infantry, the U.S. definitely did not have enough to take Tokyo. So they came down here and took this southern Japanese territory that did have a major complex on it. So now the U.S. has a minor complex, and they landed with their 5 infantry and their 5 medium armor, and they still have 3 tacticals and a fighter up in this northern Japanese island. The U.S. did think about coming down and attacking the remaining Japanese fleet. They could have brought the 2 battleships they have, the 3 destroyers, and all their planes, and they would have pretty much, I think the odds would have been in their favor to take out the Japanese fleet. But then that would have left their transports to come over here by themselves to land. So then there would have been no protection at all for their transports. The Japanese could just take one of their planes, either in Rihe or Formosa, and completely wipe out the U.S. Transport fleet. So the U.S. had to send their remaining naval surface ships with the transports to give them some protection. But now the Japanese can come over with their remaining navy here in Sea Zone 56, along with some planes, and try to take on that U.S. fleet. So it was a tough call. I think either way, the U.S. would have had a little bit of a difficulty. But at least this way, they took a territory off Japan that had a complex, and now they have a minor complex themselves. They can start producing units, and their transports at least have some protection at this point. And they do still have the Air Force to come down. I don't think Tokyo is going to fall. The U.S., as you can see, has nothing in Western Europe, nothing off of San Francisco whatsoever. So what's in Japan itself is pretty much all the U.S. has to contribute to take down the Japanese. And even with this minor complex, 5 medium armor, 5 infantry are not going to be enough to take out 13 Japanese infantry, even with the U.S. Air Force there as well. Plus, Japan will get to go before the U.S. in turn sequence. So they'll probably put down a bunch more infantry, maybe some fighters. I think Japan collected around $65, $68 this last turn. So I really don't think Tokyo is going to fall. But there wasn't much else the U.S. could do. Maybe before the Japanese can counterattack, maybe the U.S. will go ahead and take these transports, assuming they survive the Japanese portion of the turn, and land them in Asia to at least help out the CCP and the Soviet Union. That could be an option because, again, it doesn't seem like Tokyo is going to fall. So that's how things look after turn 16. Now we're coming up here on turn number 17, July 44. And at the end of this turn is when we start doing the die roll for the variable ending to the game. So this could be this is the first opportunity the game could end early. The Axis still far and away in the lead. They have still 16. The Comintern, I believe, is down to maybe 8, and the Allies are at 6. So it doesn't seem like the Allies and the Comintern are going to be able to make up enough ground, even if the die rolls extend the game for several more turns. I think that the Axis are too far ahead, and even Italy, with bonuses and income die roll, are collecting about $30 a turn. So Italy is actually more of a powerful country right now than the UK. And then Germany is just going crazy, and Japan is even still holding their own. So I don't really see the Allies being able to come back, but we shall see. Maybe make a push in Western Europe by the Allies and see if that can kind of turn the table a little bit against Germany heading into turn number 17.